Hi guys, Olive here today to review two new Jane Austen reimaginings. The first one I'll be discussing is Miss Austen by Jill Hornby. This book was published in 2020 by Flatiron Books, and the hardcover comes in at 288 pages. This is a historical fiction novel that makes a leading lady out of a somewhat unpopular historical figure that's Jane Austen's sister Cassandra. The main events of this novel take place around 20 years after Jane's death, when Cassandra, who is now in her late 60s, goes to visit the house of some longtime friends of the Austen family. She suspects that there is a collection of letters from her family, including from her sister Jane, hidden somewhere in this house, and she intends to find them. When she eventually does, very early on in the novel, and begins to go through them, the letters serve as windows into the past through which we travel with Cassandra. In this book, Jill Hornby imagines what the contents of Jane Austen's lost letters would have been. It is very widely believed that Cassandra burned many of Jane Austen's private letters after the death of the author. It's one of several reasons why, like I mentioned before, she's a bit of an unpopular figure. However, I think this novel correctly frames her actions as protective and loving. It becomes clear in this book that pretty much all of Cassandra's life, she has played the role of the caretaker. Often other people have painted her into this role, sometimes she has willingly stepped into it, and occasionally she's wanted to play the role of the martyr. This attempt to filter, or if we're putting it more harshly, to censor Jane's letters, to me is just another way that Cassandra is trying to take care of her family. In the book, she's very vocal about the fact that she thinks that Jane's works are going to live on, and therefore, by determining what material is going to see the light of day, to her, she's protecting her sister. Speaking of roles that she plays, while a guest in this house, Cass very much has to step into the role of an elderly woman in order to achieve what she needs to in secret. She's trying to throw people off the scent of the fact that she is going through these letters without anyone knowing about them and getting rid of anything incriminating. So not all of our time is spent strolling down memory lane. We actually do have some drama in the present as well. That's not to imply this book is thrilling in any kind of way, because that's not the case. It is a very gentle book. Reading it felt like rocking in a rocking chair almost, where all of the plot points are expected, but in a comforting way. The way Jane came across in Cassandra's memories was a little bit disappointing. It was kind of vanilla. Not that I was expecting fireworks, but I was hoping for a little bit more than just a watered down Lizzie Bennet. I think the character that I liked the most in this book was actually Cassandra, and I think the reason why that's the case is because of the growth we see within that character. Even at her older age, she's willing to learn new things, and we see her learn new things from the people within the household where she's visiting. Through all of her present interactions with the people in the household and through spending so much time in her memories, I feel like she gets a really good perspective on herself and her actions as a whole, and I feel like she learns a lot about herself during this period. Just as a quick aside, make sure you've read Persuasion before you pick this book up. This book doesn't spoil Persuasion, that's not the reason. It's just that they reference Persuasion quite a bit, and I feel like you'll miss those things if you haven't read the book yet. And in fact, if you're looking to do a Persuasion reread, this would be a great one to pair it with. It was a nice book. I don't know how memorable it's going to be since it did hit my palate as a little bit vanilla, but it was very cozy, very comforting. It was nice to spend time with it. Overall, I think if you like Longbourn by Joe Baker, this one might appeal to you. And speaking of Longbourn, that reimagining of Pride and Prejudice told from the perspective of the servants, the next book I'm going to be speaking about in this video is another reimagining of P&P. That book is The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. This book was also published in 2020, but by Henry Holtz, and the hardcover comes in at 480 pages. This book not only gives us Mary's side of the story in Pride and Prejudice, at least all those parts for which she was present, but it also goes far beyond that. The events of this novel begin slightly before Netherfield Hall is let, at last, and then extend far beyond into Mary's early 20s. As becomes clear when you start really thinking about the family dynamics of the Bennets, Mary is a very lonely person. Her four sisters have paired off, leaving her with no real companion. One of her parents is hypercritical and very focused on looks, and the other one is more or less absent. In Pride and Prejudice, Mary very much does come across like a hoity-toity moralist who is tone-deaf in her preaching. But Hadlow paints her with a different hue. Hadlow shows her as someone who, absent real parental figures, takes on the job herself. She throws herself into her studies so as to give herself some guidance, moral and otherwise. She also shows her as someone who has built up a defense mechanism against her parents' disapproval by painting herself into a role of a woman of no importance. She doesn't think very highly of herself, and it is a self-image that proves very hard to shake even as she gets older and comes into herself both looks-wise and personality-wise. After the events of Pride and Prejudice, and after the sudden unexpected death of Mr. Bennet, Mary is left alone with her now widowed mother. All of her sisters are married. It looks like even Kitty found a husband. And Mary is wondering when her turn is going to be. Is she ever going to get married? Does she actually want to get married? So at this point in her life, she decides to go on a tour of her options. She starts out by staying at Jane's house, but the very nasty Miss Bingley drives her right out of there. She moves on to go stay with Elizabeth, but very much feels like a fifth wheel in that family. She even goes back to Longbourn to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Collins, which is the stop on her tour that makes her think most critically about what it is she really wants out of life. It's only when Mary goes to London to stay with her aunt and Uncle Gardner that she really starts living the kind of life that she wants. She meets all these new people and she gets exposed to new ideas. It very much quenches her thirst for knowledge, but she's also having a lot of her ideas about the world challenged. Most importantly, that downcast self-image that she has. She meets not one, but two men who highly enjoy her company, resulting in a very non-annoying love triangle. And I must say, she shows a very Fanny Price-like shrewdness when it comes to deciding between them. I'm actually wondering if this author used Fanny Price as her model. This was a really nice reimagining for Mary. There are a few characters in Pride and Prejudice that when you really sit down and think about it, you realize that Jane Austen isn't entirely fair to them. Mary is one of those characters. I would also argue that Lydia is one of those characters, and Lydia is not portrayed very kindly in this book. I would argue that you don't need to vilify one sister in order to redeem another, because all of the sisters were subjected to the family dynamics of the Bennet household. All of them had to figure out how to get by with the sparse parenting that they received, and Lydia is no exception. If you didn't already know this, I do the occasional video on this channel where I look at the psychology of literary heroines, and I will admit to having a much softer view of Lydia ever since doing my video on her. In the comment section of that video, I did get several requests for me to look at Mary in the same way I was looking at Lydia in that video. But after having read this book, I'm not sure my take is necessary. I think Hadlow got a great read on Mary. I think she really considered how her upbringing, or lack thereof, would have shaped her. However, I do think the author portrayed Mary as having a whole lot more self-awareness than I personally would have given her credit for. And that self-awareness seemed to leak into the prose because there were so many knowing winks at Pride and Prejudice lines and references. It got to be just so much. Of the two books I discussed in this video, this is definitely the one I enjoyed the most. It could definitely stand to lose 30 to 40 pages worth of filler, but it is well worth your time. Now we just need one of these on Kitty, the other Bennet sister. So those were my thoughts on these two new books. Please let me know if you've read either of them, if you've heard of them, or if you're now interested in reading them after hearing me speak about them. You can let me know that or any other comments or questions you may have down in the comment section below. But if you'd prefer to find me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media, and you can find the links to all of my profiles in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.